to ask a question. Oh, I've got a nice little bird tweeting outside. All right, just so you know, this is going to be recorded. I think if you watch the recording, though, you are going to miss out on the chat. So I will try and read out some of the questions from the chat as we go. And I'll also be guided by you too. So let me know what you have special requests on. If there's certain sections where I'm going too fast, perhaps you would like a little bit more clarity. That's all up to you as to how much time we spend on various areas. And we've already had a chat as well about how we're going to focus in the beginning, at least, on those last few learning units that you haven't covered yet in any of your formative assessments. And that means when your brains are feeling a little bit tired towards the end, then we'll go back and cover learning units 1 to 3 again. So that's basically the plan this evening. And I welcome you here. Paula, you are welcome to ask any questions as well. I'll ask you to just put your hand up though if you've got any questions. I'll come back to it because I'm not always going to be looking at the chat, but I will be returning to it frequently. And then after I've gone through the exam brief for you, then I will also ask you to get your phones out. So hopefully you are on a laptop and can access this from or some other device apart from your phone so that you can interact and try some of the questions in a very stress-free way. And I can get a very good idea for what you're battling with in that regard. All right, so we all know when the exam is, hey? How long have you got? Yes, and I will definitely go over the ratios and so on with you. We've got very nice guidance in the brief on that. Next week, Friday. Thank you, Jamie. All right, so that sounds quite soon now when you put it that way. So I hope you've got a very nice exam timetable. I know you've all got different modules. As I said, we've got people from different degrees doing this module. So some of you may have a very nice exam timetable, some of you may not. But whatever happens for you, then I think it's a good idea to work backwards from that date and then have a study plan in place so that you feel not perhaps too stressed when we get to sort of Wednesday, Thursday next week and you suddenly realize you've got so much to study. Okay, so I think you've got to look after yourselves, look after your health too, get, all that stuff about water and sleep and lots of healthy food. And really, I think this is going to come down to how much you're able to remember and retain and apply. And this is why the formatives are very nice for this module, because you've had a good chance in your assignment, and I hope that your assignments went well and you practice some of that application, because the same sort of skill is going to be needed for the exam in terms of application. It's very much an application-based module, so it's not just rote learning. There is quite a lot to cover, though. I do understand that. So you are going to need to have some sort of summary. I would advise you, if you haven't created those already, to start working through that so that you've got the main points that you need to know in a nice, easy to digest format. And then when you get to the exam, it's really just a case of applying them. And then you also, in your tests, for those that wrote the test, will know that you've got a certain breakdown of questions, and it's going to be quite similar for your exam. So I thought, let's get down to the business end first and look at what the exam brief is. So you may have already covered this with your lecturer, so I'm not going to cover all the detail. This is available on the student portal, same places where you found your assignment. So you can go through perhaps some of the nuances here, but I'm going to get to the nitty-gritty of it, which is this. Basically, it's 100 marks over 2 hours. You are invigilated in a closed book exam, and that means you want to try and sort of pace yourself for, see if you can get through a mark a minute, because then you've got a nice 20 minutes buffer to go back and revisit some questions that maybe you need a bit more on. And if you want to be really scientific about it, I guess you could probably say, well, I've got slightly over a minute. But what I don't want you to do is get to the point of, oh, well, you see these only 4 or 5 questions for the case study. But what's happened there is that you run out of time, because, of course, a case study takes time to read through the case study. I don't expect it to be too long. It certainly hasn't been. But having to apply and remember the theory that's got to be applied to the case study, and write the theory and apply that theory, that all is a little bit time consuming. And that means you can lose valuable marks if you don't manage your time carefully. All right, so what they've done is just showed you here what the breakdown is. So you can expect question 1 then to be multiple choice, usually 5 multiple choice, maybe 10 multiple choice. So I think you had 5 in your test, if I recall. So I would expect 10 here. So basically 20% of your paper on multiple choice. So I don't know, how did you find the multiple choice in the test, those of you that wrote it? Did you do quite well in it? Do you know how you did? Can you remember that they were quite application based? So they may have seemed in Business Management 1A, if that was fresh in your mind from last semester, where the test was actually not so application based, but then the exam multiple choice were. So you can expect the same thing here, definitely application based. So in other words, you get asked a multiple choice question, and then they will give it to you, not just like, okay, what is the 4th step in this process, or what do you call a jobbing process? It'll be, this business is currently constructing tables where one goes from one process to another. What is that called? So it's very much application based. That means as you start studying it, multiple choice does really require you to learn your stuff, know your stuff, but also well enough to be able to apply it and understand how it's applied as well. Okay, so that's what we're expecting from question 1. You have got those micro assessments that are inside ARC. So you'll notice that for every theme of every learning unit, there's something called a micro assessment. There's just 5 questions there, but that's quite a nice way just to test your knowledge, and a lot of those are application based too. So nice little practice just to see, okay, yeah, I know what I'm doing with that. And this, I think, is a potential to get you some marks. I think it's not perhaps as difficult for those of you doing ecos, where the multiple choice can be quite difficult to do well in. So I hope that this works well for you, and it's a place where you can pick up some marks. Okay, so that is new this year. So you're not going to see that in any past BMNG5122 past papers from last year and even before that. All right, so that's why I say perhaps the only thing that you can do is really put in the effort to understand, apply, and then I think really it's important that you practice just with those micro assessments. Not really much else you can do to prepare for those. So that's why I'd like to move on to question 2. And question 2 now, as it says here, are definitions of concepts. Okay, so they're business management concepts, remember that. And then you have to explain them in detail. So basically be able to define a concept and provide examples to prove that you've understood the concept. And they've given you a snippet here out of the 2023 paper for some of these questions. And you can see that it was question 1 previously, but of course for you, now that you've got multiple choice, it'll be question 2. And typically for 5 marks. This was similar to your test as well, so not sure how well you did in that, but this is something that you can practice using past papers. So you can't say, oh, well, they're going to ask these kind of questions. You may have spotted a theme here with these questions, and in this paper, they happen to ask all of these finance type questions. in the multiple choice. So in the short questions, the define and give an example of. So that's the only time I've ever seen that. Let's have a look here at the 2024 paper. And here you can see they are more of a max. Look at that. This first question is from operations, and then we've got one from HR, and 3 is also from HR. So it's 4, and then 5 was from marketing. So that's more typical. If I look back over many years, it's more typical that you're going to get a broad range of it. Okay, so then I will check that. No, it's still recording, don't worry. Thank you for checking that. And happy birthday for next week. So I don't think that you can expect to find them all grouped for you like that. So therefore, even with this question, and I'm going to repeat this for all of the questions actually, the first job is to think, okay, what is this learning unit, or if you like to think in chapters rather, what is this chapter that they're actually asking me about, before you rush headlong in and try and answer it because you just look and see what the word is and you think, oh, I know what that means. Try and just stop yourself and say, okay, what are they actually asking? And I want to give you a very good example of that. That was question 1.2. I remember this very well last year. So it asked for maintenance hygiene factors for employee motivation. And I think lots of people just saw the word hygiene. And I ended up, and not just me, lots of the other lecturers as well, getting many people saying about how you need to be hygienic and wash your hands and so on. And that sort of status to be able to do that was what contributed to motivation. So to me, that shows a lack of thinking about, okay, I'm not going to rush in because I see this word that I know, but rather, what are they actually asking me here? Okay, right. I remember that. That is from one of the theories on motivation. That was in the HR chapter. Then you can start trying to think, and this was quite a tricky one, and you'd have to orientate yourself and say, okay, right, it's something to do with motivation. I remember there was that one who said that you get maintenance factors and motivational factors. So what are those maintenance factors? Okay, and then what you would have said in that case was that it was related to the basics that employees in the workplace need. And before you start thinking of growth and empowerment and so on, you just need the basics in place, such as a salary. Right. So if you look at those questions there, I hope that they don't seem too alien to you. And where this one was actually quite nice in 2024, they actually did give you some information there. Whereas I've also seen past papers where they wouldn't have given you the second half. So they would have just said mentoring. Describe mentoring, describe indirect compensation. So this is also the only paper where I've seen some additional information given to you. So that means that even more so when you get to question 2, you must think about what is this actually asking. And you can imagine if you just had to see hygiene factors there, you might think, oh, that's something that has got to do with being cleansy and not actually to do with motivation. They gave you the clue that it's for motivation there, but you can't expect that to happen. This is the only time I have seen it happen. And I think if you recall from Business Management 1A, they did not give this. So I perhaps expect that more. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what's required there, and we will practice some of those. And you will also see some of the past papers only had this for 3 marks, where you only had to give 1 mark on the explanation and 2 marks on the example. But latterly, it's definitely been 5 marks. And if you look at the exam brief, that's the example they're giving you. So that's why I'm actually expecting it to be 5 marks. So that's, think about it, 5% for each of those. And since hopefully you identify with many of those terms and you are able to explain it, then the only risk that you have of not doing well in that question is not giving a detailed enough example. So it's 2 marks for explaining the term. And, doesn't mean that you need to give a whole paragraph on it at all to explain it. In fact, many times a very good explanation is short and concise because you can explain it that way very easily. But there's 3 marks for the example. So if you were with me in the masterclass test, you'll know that I always say use a story. Think of a story as being what you're being asked here rather than an example. So the 2023 paper said, together with a comprehensive example. So what do we mean by comprehensive? We mean detailed. And that means, to me anyway, I think you should put a name in and tell a story. It can be yourself as a business person. It can be, and you can make it up. It doesn't have to be an example of a real thing. So if I go back to this paper again, it's not like I need to say, oh, well, the business at Unilever, when they are manufacturing their soap powders, then they use a cellular layout. It's not like anybody is expecting you to know actual businesses' uses of this, but you could say, in a business where I am making washing powder and I had to lay everything out, then you could just go and explain it like that. That's what I mean by a story. In other words, by giving a name or even placing yourself in a certain business context, you're not going to just give further theory instead of an example. So this I actually noted from one of the other lecturers who reminded me about this. Many students will give an example, but it's not actually example. So just because you use the words for example, and in this case, perhaps if I was taking the risk return principle and I had to give a relatively good short definition for it. And then I say, for example, businesses want to know whether the risk return that they get is going to exceed what the costs are. And they add on something like that. That is not an example. It's just adding more words to it. Okay, so think of it as being a proper example and try and understand what the examiner's motive is here. They're trying to get you to show that you understand the concept. Okay, and that means by applying it with the use of a detailed story there. Okay, I don't know if anybody's got any questions on that. Do you feel comfortable in answering it?
I've got a question.
Go for it.
So here, do you think this is an example of a practical example that I give? What I give because I practiced the 2023 exam earlier. Do you think this is an example of a practical explanation? I put there, for example, we come across Helen Grant, who is a florist in Mossel Bay. Helen considers expanding her flower shop by buying exotic flowers. These flowers might attract more customers and earn higher profit, but they are costlier, have a shorter shelf life, and may not sell well. Helen must decide if the potential extra revenue justifies the risk of unsold stock and bigger losses.
Perfect. So that's exactly what I mean by telling a story. You've told a very good story there. And then if you've prepared some of these and as you're studying the textbook and your notes, you can try and visualize these concepts. Then when you get to the exam situation, the example will be on tap already. However, there's bound to be some of the questions you get where you haven't managed to do that. So then my only caution is that it's 3 marks, so you don't need more than a paragraph in full for the whole question, including the definition. So that would be absolutely great. I think you may even have extended it more than is necessary. But yeah, well done. If you can do that, that'll be great. And within time. So you basically look at this and you see it's for 5 marks. So if you can do it within 5 minutes, you are sitting pretty absolutely easy to manage your time in that regard. So it's not like it's a mark a minute or a mark a point either by the way. So it's not like if it's, oh, well, 3 marks for an example, you need to give 3 sentences for it. It doesn't work like that either. But I just think in terms of managing your time well, then you don't want to spend more than 5 minutes on each of these. And I would say more or less a paragraph. And of course, some people have got bigger handwriting and some people get to the point quicker. So it's very much a loose rule of thumb, but you don't want to spend your time on giving half a page on each of those. Like I always find that there's 1 or 2 concepts that somebody just says, yes, I know this, yay. And then again, spend too long on it because there is only a maximum that can be gained from each of these. Okay, so let's carry on then and look at question 3. So this is what we're expecting now is a finance type calculation question. All right, so you need to, as the brief says here, you must show the calculation. So show your workings, and then they will give you the formulas. It's not like ecos on a separate fancy formula sheet because there's very few formulas that you need. They basically will give you just the 1 or 2 formulas that you're going to need to calculate this. So remember, it's not designed for finance students. And I think that those who are doing accounts will probably find this quite easy. I hope so. But for those who not, it's often a sticking point. And since we know that it's going to be in here, I think it's very worthwhile practicing it. It's not something that you can learn, but it's something that you can practice. So just nail it, because then, you know, it's almost like, yeah, it's finally something I actually know that's going to be in the paper. Whereas everything else, you know, you've got a whole long chapter to learn, and who knows which sections are going to come up. We know this is coming up. So this should be something that you are absolutely confident of before you even walk into the exam. Okay, so they give you a little bit of a scenario here, so expect you can probably see the same sort of thing. And then they give you all of the figures that you're going to need to do the calculations and the questions that follow. Okay, so probably worthwhile just seeing what those questions are. And here's an example of where I said they will give you the formulas. So it's right there in the middle of the question. And in this case, they didn't tell you which formula to use. They gave you a couple of choices, but not too many. And here are what the questions were. All right, so these are the typical ones you can expect. And it's not just this paper and the fact that they've given you a brief with this. It's the fact that these come up all the time. Always a break-even analysis, and then one, and you know, let's just say maybe they asked 2, but I can't see mark-wise how they can actually do that. But the second question then being one of the ratios, and typically one of the debt ratios, one of the solvency ratios. Right, so those 2, and then some theory as well. Okay, so you know, those are the kind of questions that you can expect here. And we are going to go over that when we go through the material. And like I said, as soon as we finish this, we're going to go through, starting at Learning Unit 4, as we discussed before we started. We decided that would be a good idea to start at Learning Unit 4. So we're going to practice some of these calculations for those of you who are not sure about it. But my point here is that you are given all the numbers that you need to use. You are given the formulas. So then it's just a case of meticulously answering the question. And at this point, I also, and I will, as I said, show you an actual example. But this is very important because it's not a finance exam. Those 8 marks are not just for the calculation. So it depends on how the marks get allocated. Sometimes it can be, if this was an 8-mark question, it could be 4 marks for the calculations and 4 marks for explaining it. Sometimes it's 5-3. You know, I won't know, and your lecturers won't know until they actually see the marking memo. But my point is that it's definitely marks for explaining it, and lots of students get so carried away with actually doing the calculation and nailing it that they forget to come back to the question and almost answer part 2 of it, which is analyzing your findings. Okay, so even in this question here, the asset test ratio to calculate their liquidity position, you also, with that 7 marks, if you think about it, they're giving you the formula, so you just have to pick it out, plug the numbers in. How can you get to 7 marks from that? It's because you're going to have to explain it as well. So what does liquidity mean? What did that ratio actually mean with that answer? What does it actually mean? Let me say it in English or write it down in words. And is that a good ratio or not such a good ratio? So that kind of information needs to come in there as well. So even for those of you who are a bit nervous about calculations, think about this, that there's actually quite a lot of just explanation that's required here. The calculations are not difficult though, as I say. So practice them and get those right. We will come back to those shortly. All right, and then the final question you can expect, and note that past exams had an essay. You do not have an essay. The essay this year has been replaced with the multiple choice. So I hope that's good news for many of you. And that means that your final question is going to be this case study. Okay, so yeah, I've just given you a couple of tips here in the exam brief, and you know, I don't think that it's just general information there. And in this case, they give you, I think, probably a pretty standardized size. So maybe you can expect this sort of length of case study. So also nice that it's not going to take you too long to read through and decipher. And then when you go through a case study, always worthwhile, and sometimes they call it a scenario, by the way, where the scenario is just a fictitious business. Okay, so they will expect you to be able to read it, be able to understand it, be able to link it to the theory that's being asked, and then do it in an integrated way. Okay, so in this case, there was 60 marks here. Remembering also that the 2023 paper was out of 120 marks, and this year it's only out of 100. So, you know, if we sort of take 20 marks for multiple choice and then 10 marks for the questions that are related to answering a concept, I don't know how many they're going to give you. And then your finance questions. So you might get 50, you might get 60, yeah, but it's certainly a lot of marks that are on this case study. So this is also why I say don't get lost. Okay, so you need to contact VC Assist if you are unsure at all. And yeah, so yes, and if you are writing online, then it's just a slash is absolutely fine. Okay, but if you can, try and write the formula down as well, because you often get marks for selecting the right formula, especially if they give you a couple of options to choose from. So don't leave it out just because you think, oh, well, I can't put the proper divide sign in. All right. So giving yourself enough time is important here. And then typically they're all weighted the same. And as you can see here, they were all marked out of 10. And then when, as the memo comes across, and it's been standard for many years now, we are basically told as markers that we're looking for a balance of theory and application. So there's some students are very talented at looking at that question on compensation, let's say, and then going back out there and pulling it through and just talking about the application side of things, and then think they've done marvelously. And it's actually quite sad because as markers, we can see that you completely understand compensation, but never gave any of the theory. So again, stop yourself, don't rush into it, orientate yourself. What is the learning unit? What are they actually asking you? What is the theory? What can I remember about that theory? Maybe even just scribble down a few of those things, whatever you need to do, and then you can go and try and start applying it. And then when you finish your answer and you look at it, you should say, yes, I've done a very good job because I've explained the theory, I've applied it to the case study. And top marks if you are able to explain one theory point related to the case study. Pick another theory point, explain it related to that case study. That's what they call integration. You may have noticed that in your assignments. Same job here. So the chapters on the exam are all of them, I'm afraid. So right from, and including the chapter that's not even an official chapter in the book, but starting with operations management. So 6 learning units, 5 of which are chapters in your book and 1 that's only on ARC. Okay, and we're going to do that now. Okay, so then I think the last thing that I want to mention about this is when you see these case study type questions, always pay attention to what you're being asked to do. So analyze is asking you to think a bit higher order thinking, a little bit of critical analysis going on there. So in other words, here, you wouldn't just list the types of compensation. You would want to say, okay, what is it that they're doing in this compensation? Yeah, okay, they're giving direct compensation. What does that mean? And then, you know, when you look at how they've done their, whatever the scenario happens to have gone over, is it quite overweight on direct versus indirect? So in other words, try and do a bit of analysis there, because that's what you're asked
until I tell Joan about this.
And then explanation as well. So explanation is a relatively, can I say, easier. So you're not asked to really analyze, evaluate, justify, or any of those more higher order thinking questions. You just need to explain it. And then, as you know, every single question in the case study has got to be applied. So yes, of course, you're going to explain it and apply it by using examples. Evaluate now. Evaluate is asking you to think really higher order thinking now. So now there you need to say, okay, well, what is that vision statement like? And you would have to think, what are the criteria of a good vision statement? Remember what they are, and then go and look at what theirs is and say, yes, it complies with that first criteria. No, it doesn't comply with the second criteria. And yes, it complies with the third criteria. My evaluation is that they've got 2 out of 3 wrong, and their vision statement could be stronger. So that's an evaluation. If you ask to differentiate, then you need to find what are the 2 terms, and you need to first of all remember what's the difference from them about them from a theoretical position. So also stop and think, okay, what were those family brands? So remember, that's a marketing question. What is the difference now? And then you want to show that when you apply it to the case study, you have explained each of those terms and shown how they are different. And here we've got a simple question again, just the advantages. No need to do anything extra than that. Just go and look in the case study and apply it. And then finally, another higher order question. So recommend, the verb that's being used there is, okay, now I have to look at that case study and say, right, this is what their situation is. And I need to think of a hierarchical level. And then you think, okay, so what does that mean now? Can I remember what the advantages are of the different types of hierarchical levels? What were the hierarchical levels in purchasing and supply? And then you think, oh, yes, I remember that they could be right at top management, or they could be at middle management. So where should they be now? I need to make a recommendation. I can go and look at the case study and say, aha, I see in this case, they were with their purchasing, and their raw materials were, it's probably a really large part of the expenses of the business, and they need very tricky negotiations with their suppliers. And for that reason, I recommend that they are in a higher hierarchical level. So you can see, hopefully, that that's a little bit more evaluation. Okay, so any questions on that? That is your exam brief. And if I just show you here, there's another very similar type example that was from the 2024 paper. And as we've seen, you can expect something very similar to this, where they give you the numbers, and then they give you some of the formula to use, and then there they go. And it's just which ratio they're going to ask of you, usually a debt or solvency. Do the break even, and then a little bit of theory to add on. And then in this case, it was 50 marks for scenario and questions. And again, you say, right, identify and explain. So that's just a case of figuring out which one it was. Evaluate. So now I need to think a little bit harder about that. Suggest, recommend are quite similar. So quite a lot of higher order thinking questions in this last year's paper. And there's just a summa describe, so not too difficult. All right. No questions on that, I see. So that means that we can start going through things, and I am going to jump ahead and actually take you to halfway through this, because I think while you're still feeling quite fresh, let's go and apply some of your knowledge to the learning units 4, 5, and 6, and then we'll go back to 1, 2, and 3. So if you are able, join on your phone. Okay, that just means that you'll be able to answer some questions and so on. Okay, I'm going to give you a minute to do that as well. see lots of very interesting looking names that you've come up with there. So I don't know if you know which one you are, but whoever's creative pasta, that's very interesting. And we see the beauty of AI in action there by just randomly assigning two adjectives and a noun together. I also quite like the crazy platypus. All right, so if for some reason you get kicked out or maybe you join late or so on, then this Curie.live will always be available at the top of the screen, and you just need to pop that pin in and you'll be able to join in. Okay, I'll try and come back to the chat as well in case you don't or you're unable to join on your phone. Then please answer the question in the chat as well. I will come back to that, but at least this way we can check, and then it also will let you mark each other's every now and then, and we can just see how you go. At least it makes it a little bit more interactive. Okay, so maybe you want to get your textbooks out. You might be able to do that, but this is more just an exercise for you to see what to expect and check some of your knowledge on it. And it doesn't really matter if you know the answers at this stage, because of course I'm sure many of you have not started studying yet, but maybe if nothing else it'll give you a chance to do that. Okay, so now you need to just bear with me, because I am going to have to figure out, I'm running through all of these very fast, because I do think it is a good idea to get to the finance section first, and then I will give you a break, and then we will return to study units 1 to 3. And you've basically covered that. For those of you who have written the test, you know that already. But for us now, I think let's start on finance. Okay, so let's go. If you've got your book, you can see that this is chapter 15. It's a long chapter. And actually, before I go any further, I actually mean to just hope that you paid attention to, where is it? Here. Yes, very important. So I don't know if you noticed in the module outline, but it was actually based on the 11th edition of the book. Okay, so you have to do sections 14.6. Okay, so focus on that. In other words, you don't need to know all of this chapter. There's the sections on future value. Remember net present value, you may have done that in school. And then also capital budgeting, that section as well. That's later on in the book. You don't need to know that either. So it's like the only chapter where there's sections that you don't need to know. So definitely don't go learning all of that. Okay, let me get back to this. All right, so yeah, just some of the things to note here. So, and I think those of you that have just done the assignment will be very familiar with this. Hopefully you nailed your question on this and you remember what all of these terms are. So quite often they do ask you some questions about this. So what is the difference between a fixed asset and a current asset, or what are the assets used in this business, and be able to describe those. And then from the liability side, what do you find on the statement of financial position or the balance sheet? And yeah, I don't think you need reminding of that. Hopefully you did well in that in your exam, in your assignment. All right, so then just some terminology as well. So this could well be asked as a kind of question 1.1 or 2.1 now, where you have to explain a term and give an example of it, or it could be asked in the context of your little scenario where you may get a couple of theory questions in addition to the calculations. So remember that capital, we're not talking about money there, we're talking about investment from the firm. Okay, same thing with income, another term just to learn and understand. So, we get our revenue from, and how that then links into profit. And as you work through this chapter, then I recommend that you make your own sort of list of terminology that you either understand or don't. So we know that there's some accounting students, for example, who know this already. So that doesn't apply. But if these terms are not something you're familiar with, then maybe this is something that you need to just make a list of and have these terms on tap so that you can explain them. Same thing with costs. And this, even if they don't ask you specifically to define them, you do need to know the difference between fixed and variable costs to be able to do the break-even analysis, which we'll look at shortly. So in this case, understanding that the fixed costs are what the business has to pay on a monthly basis. So in the example of your break-even, it's the bigger number that's going to be there. Don't get them confused. And then the variable costs are going to be things that change, and particularly when you think about on a per unit basis, whatever you're manufacturing, that should be based on 100 t-shirts is going to cost you more than if you just make 10. All right, this is not a kind of calculation that you need to know. Yes, so it is chapter 14 in both editions. What I was trying to say is it's that section. You do need to know the section on financial ratios. Okay, so in the module outline, they mentioned that you need to know, I think it was 14.7, but just pay attention to that so that you don't learn the wrong stuff. Okay, so yes, they are all in chapter. If you've got the finance edition, so don't worry about the sections number then. If you've got the 11th edition, just remember you don't need to know present and future value. You do need to know the ratios. Then you'll be fine. Okay, yes, and I will give you these slides. They're very much summarized though, but yes. Okay, so coming back from the chat then, it's an overall section in your book that then introduces some of these components. So again, just some terms to understand there, and what is it that affects a company's profit. So an understanding is really what's required here. I don't think it's worthwhile just rote learning these unless you understand. So the most important one here is the break even. Okay, so you need to have a situation where the company is covering its costs. All right, and then of course that's the calculation that's going to be there again. So you saw this, and if I go to the past 2 exams, they've given it to you in exactly the same way. Here it is. Okay, they don't though say that this is break even, or which debt ratio this is. Same thing over here.
Sorry to interrupt, but the recording has stopped.
How has that happened? Let me check. It's still going from my side. It's still showing that it's going. Okay, because I started. Thank you though for warning me, but yeah, we look all good. Thank you, Leah. All right, then if you see then those examples, the one exam they did tell you that it was a break even, the one they didn't. So I recommend that you just assume that it's not necessarily going to be there. So if you see just that, if open brackets, SP minus V, you need to know what each of those stand for, and that this is in fact the formula for the break-even analysis. However, you don't need to learn it off by heart. So it's not like they're going to ask you what to calculate the break-even analysis and that then you just left to do it yourself. Okay, and it's also not like in your exam that you need to then explain what each of these components are, but I would advise you to write it down, because especially, and if I'm trying to remember here now, in this exam where they didn't tell you that this was N equals or that this was a break even, you actually got 1 mark for that. And then in this exam where they told you break even, then you didn't get a mark for writing it down. But just to be safe, write it down. And then it's a case of figuring out from the list of numbers that they give you, which are the fixed costs, which are the variable costs. So that's what the F is the fixed costs and the V is the variable costs. You can't get those mixed up. And to go back to these ones again, if we had a look over here, they tell you, oh, okay, there's my S selling price. And then they've got a whole lot of other stuff there, but that was to work out the debt ratios. And then you can see, okay, cost of production for materials, 20 Rand each. And then rent, 12,000, salaries, 18,000. So I'm not going to ask you to do this on CuriePod now, but does anybody want to tell me then, out of these figures here, which ones are which is the variable cost, which is the fixed cost? Thank you, Megan. Good. Okay, fantastic. So remember what I was saying earlier, the fixed costs are usually the bigger ones because it's not per unit. So that always helps you. Right, good. So sometimes they might only give you one number. Other times like this, they mix it up and you've got to deduce from the figures you're given where to plug what into in the formula. Okay, so exactly. So we would take the fixed cost, we'd have to have added those two together at the top, and in the bottom, it's the selling price minus the 20 Rand. Okay, other times that you just never know. Okay, so this is an activity I'm going to give you to do. And then this was actually a past paper question, and they've given you an extra little question there. So if you've got time, you can answer the how would you lower this point. But I just want you to calculate it in the meantime. So look on your phone. Hopefully you've got a piece of paper or something you can scribble this down on. And also a note that must take your calculators with you into the exam.
I got an answer.
Okay.
The answer is 100.
Okay. Let's see, other people are putting it on QueryPod, so let's give them a chance for that. And then if you're on QueryPod as well, you can tap the little A there and you can type your answer in as well. And then you remember if you wanted to get full marks, you would put the formula in, you would substitute the values in, then you would give your final answer, and then you would also write down what the answer is to the how would you lower this point. Okay, and I haven't told you what the overall mark was for this. 6 marks. I'm going to give you 6 marks for this, and then I'll tell you how I would award you marks based on it. Okay, so you've got 1 minute left. See if you can answer that question as well. Okay, 30 seconds left. Okay, just I think get ready to submit whatever you got because it's going to lock you out in about 15 seconds time. And submit. All right, let's see now. You're going to look on your phone again. You're going to vote for who you think is going to get the 6 out of 6 for that. Lots of good answers here, so well done. I think I'm going to give you just a little bit more time to do your votes. And last chance. And let's see who got the most votes, and I'll let you know if I agree too. Okay, there we go. Right, so let's have a look. So what do I like about this? Okay, so first of all, put down what each of them were, so that's great. First mark would be awarded for the formula. Second mark would have been awarded for substituting the values into the formula, so don't forget that step. And then last one would have been for the mark, and then unfortunately, just saying variable costs is good, but not quite enough. So let's see what number 2 or number 3 got. Okay, so I'm just looking from over here. The only thing wrong with number 2 in my mind was that the formula wasn't in. And this is perhaps, yeah, this is good. So there's your mark, 1 for the formula, 2 for putting in the values there, and I would say perhaps even for substituting them in, you would have got 2 marks for that, so 3 altogether. 4 for the final one. It would have been nice to say the 100 units, you know, especially in the question, they'll probably tell you what it is that they're making. But then, yes, those are the points there. It's, you could increase the selling price. Don't forget, it's not either or. You could increase it or reduce the fixed or variable costs, or both. So well done there, and I hope that's giving you a very good idea of what you need to do to maximize your marks for that. Good. Okay, so that's 1 down, and we know that that comes up every single time, so that's great. I hope that that is, you feel confident in how to answer that now. And don't forget, to go back to QueryPod, you should see at the top here, query.live, and there's the pin. Okay, so just choose that. Okay, so then we come to the ratios, and typically it's the first 2 ratios, and that's the liquidity, the 2 in liquidity, the 2 in solvency. Good idea to familiarize yourself with what those actually mean, and you know, what does it mean for a business to be liquid? What does it mean for it to be solvent? So, you know, although one of those is inevitable to come up as a calculation, remember you have to explain the calculation, which means understanding what those exactly mean as well. Okay, so the first one is a liquidity ratio, and there's your definition for it. And this is an important thing to know about a business. How liquid are they? Right, so can they cover their current liabilities with their assets? That's really what it's saying. And you saw in those examples, let's have a look at them again. In the brief, they gave you both of them and they actually told you which was which. And then in the 24 exam, okay, it was asking you the different ratio, but still, in this case, they didn't tell you which is which. So remember, you must know which one is which. Okay, so the top one then is the current ratio, and the asset test ratio then says, okay, well, it's all very well covering our liabilities with our assets, but we don't really want to have to sell our inventory or our stock to do that. So perhaps a better test is the asset test ratio, which says, okay, take our debtors and they owe us money and our cash in the bank. Can we use that to cover what we owe in terms of our liabilities? We don't really want to have a fire sale of all our stock just to cover our liabilities. That's not going to mean we're in a very good position. Okay, so that knowing what they mean is important, knowing which ratio is which. And then I don't know if you know or can remember which one of these now has which recommended ratio. So your answer to a ratio then is going to be with a colon in between. So 2 to 1. If I had an answer of 2 to 1, that means I have 2 times the amount of current assets to liabilities. So written as, maybe I'll just put it in the chat. So you see exactly what I mean by that. 2 to 1, like that. So your answer should be looking in a ratio format. And then what is the ideal ratio? What are we looking for? Because remember what I said, you have to be able to evaluate it as well. So it's all very well being able to calculate it, but what does it mean? Go for it. Nathan?
Sorry, I wanted to ask, is it okay if I leave a bit early? I can always watch the recording when I
Yes, of
have time.
course. Of
Because
course.
okay.
No problem. No problem.
All right.
Okay, so Nina has given us the ratios there. Thank you. You need to learn that. They're not going to tell you that information. So that is something you must learn about this. The current ratio ideal or recommended ratio is 2 to 1. So you want double the current assets to current liabilities. And for the asset test, it must be 1 to 1. So when you evaluate an answer, you're going to compare it to that. You're going to need to write those numbers down. You're going to need to remember it. So if you're asked to evaluate your current ratio, you're going to say, well, this ratio is, let's say, 1.5 to 1. Well, that is actually lower than the recommended ratio of 2 to 1. So this company is not, the liquidity position is not ideal because they are lower than the recommended. And the same thing for the asset test ratio. Let's say the answer came out at 1.2 to 1, then you can say, well, comparing this to the recommended ratio of 1 to 1, this company is in quite a strong liquidity position because their ratio is higher than the recommended. Okay, so that's typically how you get asked to evaluate this type of question. All right, good. So let's give this one a go on your phones again. Current ratio, so you must remember which one that is. And I know it doesn't say so on the question, but please also evaluate it, like I explained how to do. One thing that I forgot to mention to you is you must round off to 2 decimal places, please. Okay, so regardless of which type of question you get, if it's any sort of calculation, always to 2 decimal places. Okay, it looks like most of you are done, so I'm just going to give you another 20 seconds. If you're still busy with it, just tap in your answer and finish it off, because I'm going to stop it at let's say 120. Okay, so submit if you've got anything. Right, let's see how well you did again, and you can look on your phone. Let's see what you would have awarded. So I'm glad to see there's a lot of the right answers coming on, so that's good. Got the calculation right. And there's some good explanations too. I know you haven't got a lot of space, as in, you've got a limited screen size on your phones, but we definitely need a bit longer explanations if this was your exam. I'm sure you are well aware of that. Okay, and finish off. Right, let's have a look. Oh, somebody see, look how nice these explanations are. So yes, there we go. Very nice. So rounded off. So tick there, got the formula in, substitute the values in, tick, tick, tick. And then the recommended current ratio is 2.1, and this ratio is 1.69 to 1. Fantastic. Full marks for that. Well done. And I suspect that we've got the same thing. Very nice. And now we've even got, oh, yes. Actually, this one's even better. You know why? Because it's written out in English. So step one, after having got the calculation, is write that out in English. For every £1 owed, the business has 1.69 in current assets. It is financially stable. Only thing that's missing from this one is where's the comparison to the recommended ratio? Okay, great. And so this one, you would have just liked to have it written out in English too. So if you can, show that you understand what that means as opposed to just as a ratio. But those are minor points. Well done to all of those people, if those were you, and I'm sure there were lots of others I saw that were quite close to that. So excellent, excellent. Okay, I forgot that I'd asked you to interpret it here, but I'm going to leave that because I did it then previously. Okay, let's give this one a go. The asset test ratio. Let's give that a go. And I'm not going to give you as long for this. You should know how to do it. And hopefully you remember what to do in terms of what the recommended ratio is and some of the feedback that I gave you for the current ratio. Okay, and I think I'll give it to about 2 minutes just because I want to get through the next lot. So yeah, asked if you had rounded it to you would have probably just not got the last mark there because the rounding is not quite right. So it wasn't rounding up because it wasn't closer to 1.7. But I think that would be the minor one. And I can't say 100% sure because it would depend on what my memo and what the markers memos had to say. Because sometimes they give a mark for that, sometimes they don't. But now you know anyway, that's the whole point of doing this. No problem. Okay, so I'm giving you another 45 seconds to try and finish that. And I am spending quite a bit of time on this. I still want to do the solvency ratios because, as we know, this is the one thing that you know is going to be there. So let's make sure you all maximize your marks. All right, 20 seconds more, please, to submit what you've got. Okay, submit, submit, submit. Right. Okay, let's see, mark yourselves. And maybe you can do this when you're in the exam and say, okay, yep, I'm going to mark myself now. I know I got 100% for this. And I'm sure in the exam situation, when you actually write on a piece of paper, it'll also be easier. Hey? And remember that I'm not giving you a lot of time, but if this is a 6-7 mark question, you know you easy got 7 minutes to do it in. And look, I'm only giving you like 3, 4. So maybe this will actually be a place where you can pick up a bit of time. Right, last couple of votes coming in. Right, very nicely done. Well, I don't think I need to look any further because to me this is full marks. There's the ratio, there's substituting the values in, there's the answer in. Only thing is it should be 1.23, not 1 colon, but I'm quibbling now. And then it's written out in English. So for every 1 rand, actually it's liabilities. For every 1, yeah, okay, that's I guess good enough as well. And then the minimum or the recommended amount is 1.1, which means this business is, and then I think it got cut off a little bit, is in a solid liquidity position. Okay, there we go. And then it was this is just missing that last step, which is that since they are over the current recommended ratio, they're in a good liquidity position. Okay, very nicely done. Good. Okay, excellent. Right, and I'm not going to ask you to interpret it because you did that as part of it. So typically it ranges between one of these two, either the liquidity or the solvency ratio. So in this case, it's right. Solvency is now, can you pay your total debt? So if you are not solvent, you're basically bankrupt. So also a really important calculation to know. And then this one, I think the only thing that's maybe a little bit confusing here is that the gearing ratio is in a ratio format like we've just done, but the debt ratio times by 100 will tell you that your answer is going to be in a percentage. So just to note that. And then usually we were looking for 50%. That's what we guided as. So let's give this one a go. Remember, debt ratio is total debt divided by total assets times by 100. So debt on the top, assets on the bottom, times by 100, since in the exam you are given the formula. And then, like you saw in the 24 paper, the gearing ratio, they don't tell it to you. Remember that that's the one that's got the owner's equity. The debt ratio is the one that's just got debt and assets. No, so financial management is not only based on that, but the rest of it's just theory. I don't think it's too difficult. It's just that we know when we look at the past papers and what's been given in the exam brief, that these are the calculations that you can be expecting to have to be able to do. So the break even, and then one of the financial ratios as well. Who knows what's in the rest of the paper? We can't tell. This is the only thing that we know for sure. Okay, it's in the exam brief, and if you look at past papers, it's there as well. So I am spending quite a bit of time on this because I want you to get as close to full marks as you can for it, and it's one thing I can at least help you with that, get you through this part of the paper. And also for those students who are not studying accounts or interested in it, it's often quite poorly answered. Okay, the rest of it, yeah, it's explaining this concept, knowing the terms in financial management, you know, what are the sources of financing for small business and that kind of thing. But those you can just learn. This is just practice. Okay, I'm going to take you down to 2 minutes again. So if you can try and finish off what you've got there. So remember, it is just the debt ratio. You're going to take the formula of debt divided by assets times by 100, and you're going to compare that as well to the ideal of 50%. And then just to finish that off, I'm not sure if you were here earlier, the other calculations that are in this chapter in terms of net present value, future value, and then the capital budgeting, you don't have to know those. Okay, they are out of scope. You don't even need to be able to explain them from a theory point of view. They are left out. Okay, finishing this off now. Submit if you are on the last stages. Just submit what you've got. And counting down. Right, let's have a go. Not that many this time. I hope that's just, you're happy with what to do at least. Okay, so looking good in terms of the calculations, and hoping it's just because it's not so easy to write your explanation or interpretation of it that's
Hi, ma'am.
why.
That
Yes.
is exactly the reason, because I'm busy writing down.
Okay,
That is
sorry.
exactly the reason why for me, because I'm struggling. I think my nails are
Yeah.
too long for my phone. So
I feel you. Good. Well, that's fine. No
so
problem.
okay, so that's fine. So okay, thank you.
And you know, in the exam, that's not going to be a problem because you'll be writing on a piece of paper, so you'll be all good.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I think we're just about coming to the end there, and then I think if nothing else, because this is some area where I very often see that I know that students have understood it. The calculation is right, but maybe only getting 5 out of 8, such a waste because the interpretation or the explanation is not there.
Hi, ma'am.
All
Sorry,
right.
I just got 2 questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The 2 things you said that's definitely not coming in. What was that? Sorry, I was just busy calculating.
Yeah, so
When you said that.
it's actually in the exam brief. Okay, so
Yeah.
that there was an error in the module outline because the module outline still was talking about the 11th edition of the book, and this year it got changed to the 12th edition. So that means that you do not need to know present and future value, but you do need to know the ratios, as we've been talking about now, because the module outline suggests that it's the other way around. And then the other thing, which is the same in both books, so that is correct in the module outline, is that you don't need to know the capital budgeting. So basically, in terms of calculations, it's only this that you need to know. Shame, are you feeling tired?
So we don't need.
Yeah.
So we don't need to know present and future value and capital budgeting.
Yeah.
And then I just want to confirm that you said the formulas will be in the exam, so we don't need to learn that off by heart.
Yes, they're definitely in the exam.
Okay,
definitely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, very nice. So this one got voted to the top, and I think that suggests that they've got too much debt compared to assets. The calculation is correct. The formula is there. So very nicely done. Well done to whoever that was. Good. Okay, so then there's a gearing ratio to your last one I'm going to get you to do. So let's give that one last one, and then because you don't have to learn it, I will just remind you of what the solvency ratio is. This is going to be answered in a ratio format, and it is owner's equity divided by debt. Give it a good go, your last chance, and I will leave you a bit more time, even if your nails are long. Okay. I will also just give you a clue for this one. So it has to be answered in a ratio format. So remember the colon between the two numbers. And then in the gearing cases ratio, the larger, the more favorable. And a minimum gearing ratio is recommended of 1:1. So that's what you will use for your interpretation. And, I think if you read through the book and if you ask somebody who is in finance, they might say, well, these, it's not always true. It depends on the business. So yes, that is true. But in terms of what we need to know, and just as a sort of baseline, then we just go with these as a general way of interpreting us. Yes, so being able to do the calculation and of course have your calculator with you and then being able to interpret it 100%. That's exactly right, because that's why I'm saying, if you think about it, if you only get 4 out of 7, that's not so good. That's only just over a pass, whereas you should be able to get a nice break there. Okay. And 10 minutes. I will give you a 10-minute break shortly. Okay, I'm just going to go through the last little bit of finance with you. Okay, because the rest of it's not too bad, because yeah, I want to show you the profitability ratios just in case it comes up. Quite often those seem to come up more in the SUPs. Hopefully you won't be writing a SUP though. And I encourage you to all sit your first sitting, do whatever you can to get there. All right, I'm going to take you down to 1:30 for this. See if you can get that answer in 1 minute. I'll give you till 1 minute. So try and finish off and at least submit what you've got. Okay, counting you down. Definitely getting tired, hey? Right, stopping you at a minute. Okay, submit, please. Right, quick vote. Oh, there's some really good answers here now. We have upped our game. Well done. Okay, good. I want to give you just a couple more minutes, or not minutes, seconds to finish the voting too. Right, so also pay attention to how many marks they're going to allocate for this, and you know how much interpretation you need to do. So this is the one that won, and then again, we've got the whole process laid out there, rounded off, written as a ratio, so very nicely done. And then for every R1 of debt, the business had R1.47 of owner's equity, so written out in English, tick mark for that. The minimum gearing ratio is 1.1, tick mark for that. But what does this actually mean? So it's just missing that last point, which is to say that this business has a higher gearing ratio than the minimum required. So, and then talk back to what are we referring to? So from a solvency perspective, this company is in a favorable position. So that's how you would round and complete it. All right, well done, well done. I'm happy that you've got those. And then just to note, and I'm not going to ask you to work through these, but you know, these are some of the other ones that you might be asked to do. They don't really give you as much with these. You know why? It's because the evaluations are a little bit easier there. I mean, obviously, the more profit, the better, right? So it's not like the concept of profit is that challenging compared to trying to understand what liquidity is and what solvency is. But they do sometimes ask it, so you know, just be aware of those. And the examples in the book are pretty good as well. All right, and then the rest of this chapter is just, okay, being able to explain what the terms mean. And in terms of the types of budgets, so it's also not a case of having to break them down, but just a general understanding from a business person's perspective. So if you were a business owner, then you need to be able to understand just some of what the basics are in terms of financial control and the types of budgets there are. For example, what is the difference between traditional budgeting, where if you do your own budgeting, you'll know that you look and see what you've been spending, and then you try and use that to predict you. And then the same thing with these last ones. I'm just going to mute you, sorry. And then zero-based budgeting, we just start again from scratch. So I think if you look at some of those terms, this is just adding on to that list that I suggested that you write earlier. Like, do I remember what this means? And if you know what it means, then leave it. And if you don't, just keep going on, because I don't think there's anything else that's too difficult here. Okay, so for example, knowing what is a current asset versus a fixed asset, and being able to give examples of those, and why do we need them? And then, you know, what is it about carrying cash that you might think is always good for a business, but there's costs of that. You know, you could have invested it, and it's going to lose its power over time. So there, it's just the understanding, I think, again, that comes in. Same with if concepts like debtors and debtor management is not something that you're aware of, then be able to explain that and try and understand, what does this actually mean now when a business is going to give credit to its customers? And you know, what is that something that a business needs to manage? And in terms of a good debtor policy, what does that actually mean? And I wanted to just show you some of these terms. So I've seen them ask you these before. Quite nasty, I think, if it's not something you're familiar with, but know what these are as a method of financing a business just in the short term. So yeah, but get some money from the bank if you can in the terms of an overdraft, or be able to pay your suppliers a bit longer, but also then the terms of like accruals and factoring. Those are perhaps the most difficult terms to learn, so that just be aware of them. They don't usually ask too much about it. Same thing with the shareholders' interest. Like, what is a shareholder? What does that mean from a finance perspective? How does that relate to that owner's equity? And I think if you put yourself in the position, say, okay, if I was going to start whatever business that you perhaps are interested in, or maybe one that you're working in already, then that is going to help you be able to explain this if you get asked it as a term where you have to give that 2 marks explanation, 3 marks story or example, or if it comes up like we saw in, was it in this paper here, you know, where they, no, not that one, this one, where they just ask you to compare these two terms. Well, you have to know what they actually mean to be able to do that. Okay, so the same thing there. But most of the marks, as you've seen, are going to come from those calculations. All right, and then, this is also just something that I've seen them ask before, like what are the sources of financing? And if you go through the book, if you just develop some sort of summary for this, and I've just picked out a few things here. I haven't gone over them all. So yes, while I'm happy for you to look at the slides, you need to have your own comprehensive summaries, and those summaries need to be unique to you, because there's some terms that you may know and some that you don't. So from a personal finance perspective, maybe you understand and you know what personal funds are, you know what loans are, you know what trade credit is, and this is not something that you need to put on your summary notes to study. So make your own notes from this chapter. All right, so it is time for a break, and after the break, we're going to do purchasing management. Okay, so I will provide the slides out, and I will come back to some of these questions as well now. All right, but everybody else, you can go and have a break until 10 past. And if you've got questions, you can stay on. So how do you calculate current assets? Okay, that was actually in that paper, that was actually not captured properly from that. This was the 2023 paper, and I don't know where they got that from. It wasn't calculate the current assets. I think in this, if it was asked like that, then it would have been from a balance sheet or something that I've seen them do before, like you had to go and pick out from that all of the current assets. I'm pretty sure that this question here, though, was just a explain what current assets are for the company, and be able to show that you understand what they are. So that is a bit of an odd one, because when you look at this, 8 marks for quite a lot, calculate and explain, 7 marks for calculate and explain, just to be able to calculate the current asset from that information. Yeah, doesn't seem right. So I would just recommend you ignore that. Okay, so don't let that confuse you. So so please don't think these slides are that wonderful. They are just giving you an overview and points that I wanted to make for what to cover, but your lecturers will all have access to them. Okay, we've got a Teams channel, and I will be putting them there. All right, have a quick break. I am here, though, if you want to ask questions. Yes, indeed. So let me actually just show you. Sorry, let me go back because I see there were a couple of questions there too. Okay, draw the graphs. No, you don't need to be able to draw the graphs. And then I'm going to show you what's not needed in 14. Let me just show you specifically here in your book. And get all the way down here. Right. Expand this up a bit. Those are the graphs you were talking about. Yeah, you don't need to know those. You won't be able to draw them, put it that way. Right, so it's this, the time value principle. Okay, so you do need to know 4.6. So as I'm sure you're well aware of having calculated those, you do need to know 4.6, unlike what the outline says, because that is this edition of the book. Those of you that have got the 11th edition, I know there's quite a few of you, then you just pay attention to what the subject matter is, because the sections are a little bit different. Okay, so you don't need to know that section there. That's coming up after the ratios. 4.7. So you need to scroll down. There's a zero-based budgeting I was talking about. Here we go. 4.7, the time value of money. So whatever book you've got, go there and you'll see that this talks about present value, future value. It's that calculation. You don't need to know any of that. And then what is the section number? It's later on, the investment projects. Yeah. So having a look at how to evaluate an investment and you sort of long-term, none of the other calculations basically. And there's net present value again, the discounted rate, trying to be able to evaluate what you're going to budget on or what you're going to spend your capital on. So you'll see none of those calculations you need to know. This whole section here. Here we go, section 14.9, long-term investment decisions and capital budgeting. Okay. Pleasure. Yeah, it's just those two sections. I'm just trying to remember what 4.8 was on. Yeah, no, you do need to know this. Not like in terms of what being able to calculate budgets or anything like that, but you need to know just the concepts. That's it, just the concepts from here. So be able to describe what an asset is, how you should be able to manage it, the fact that you don't want too much cash, too little cash, and how you should manage your debtors. That was in your assignment, so hopefully you remember that. Okay, but just I would say generally most of the marks for this usually come from the calculation, so just know the terminology. That's probably the best thing. We will be finished at about 8. Yeah, because I'm not going to spend so long on the other things because we don't know what you're going to get. You just have to learn it basically. So I'm just going to go through some of the sections that commonly come up or that are not answered that well or understood that well. Okay, but we are going to start in literally 30 seconds time again with purchasing management. So purchasing management is the last chapter in the book, but remember it's not the last learning unit. It's also quite long and I think it's quite interesting. Supply chain is huge these days. Think about the global supply chains that happen. It's actually phenomenal. The kind of technology and thinking and lots of AI use there too to automate supply chains. And in terms of your questions for the exams, it's probably something that's asked quite frequently in the case study kind of scenario-based questions as opposed to those initial questions which are just asking you to explain a term and give an example. Okay, so let's get going with that then. I'm just going to, before we even start, just show you the typical type of questions you get. So here you are, recommend a hierarchical level. So asked in that case, and in this exam, hierarchical level happened to be 2 in a row, and then also inventory control. So those are the common type of questions asked in this chapter. So let's just go through them. So, you know, why is it so important? And understanding this is going to help you decide when you ask the question, when you ask to evaluate something or recommend, should this be centralized? Should it be decentralized? Should it be top management? Should it be middle management? So those kind of things are, if you look here, what this chapter is mostly based on, and in those 4 overall areas. Okay, so there's 2 aspects here. So very, very often, like 50% of the time, these kind of things come up. So first of all, what do we mean by centralization versus decentralization? Well, if you have got 4 different branches all over the country, but your head office is in Joburg, and there all of the purchasing is done at head office, then you are centralized, versus if you let each of the branches all over the country handle their own purchasing, then you are decentralized. And of course, you do get a combination of those both. All right, so if you look at your book, there's advantages and disadvantages to each of those. And the advantages of centralization are the disadvantages of decentralization and vice versa. So you only have to learn one list there, because just know it's the opposite for the other. That is something worthwhile knowing, because that is how you're able to ask a kind of, or answer a recommendation type question. Okay, so definitely know the difference between them and know what the advantages and disadvantages are of those. And then the other question that comes quite often, as you saw, maybe not this time because it was in 23 and 24, but never say never, is the hierarchical level. And you know what, it might even just be in one of the shorter questions. So definitely worth knowing. And this is just understanding what makes an individual section here for, is this an important function for this specific business? So that's why I say this chapter comes up in the application, in the case study. So your final question of the paper, this is typically where you be able to find this. So you would need to read and engage with the case study and say, right, I know that these are the factors that push the importance up for the purchasing function, one of which is being that they spend a lot of money on it, or that it's very complicated and you need specialist buyers for it, or a close relationship with your suppliers. So those are the kinds of factors that would help you with those higher order thinking questions where you're asked to recommend a level for the organization to place its purchasing function. Because otherwise, if it's not that important, you just buying the same old material, doesn't require any much thinking, or it's not too expensive if you make a mistake, then quite often the purchasing and supply function goes under the operations department. So it drops a level down. And if you think about it, this whole module, we are changing hats from being a finance manager to a marketing manager, an HR manager, etc. So this is one of those ones that, yeah, it could be on the same level as those, but maybe it's a little bit lower. And that's what you need to be able to decide on that. So I'm just mentioning that because it requires an extra bit of level of thinking there, and then go through these and know what the advantages are of having a centralized head office, and imagine if that was a business that you're thinking of. And I recommend that as you work through all of the material in your book, think of your business idea or a business where you work or you'd like to work at, and visualize that in every single function, including this, as to why you should have centralized, or in this case, decentralized as well. So there's a number of different points that will help you decide on which one you recommend. And then, of course, as I say, a combination of both is often what happens in reality too. All right. So given that information, give it a go, a quick 30-second one on your phone. What would you recommend now for an online retailer of electronic products? Not very long, I know, but if you had a chance to quickly post your reply. Interested to what we see there. Okay, so a combination. So I would agree with that. Tending towards, perhaps because it's an online retailer, often online retailers have a central warehouse, think Amazon and Takealot and so on, or a couple of them. But a combo is always a good guess if you are asked to recommend and there's not very specific information that's given. So good on that. Here's the information that you would need to have for a hierarchical level. So these are the things that it depends on. As you can see there, I mentioned quite a few of them before. Interestingly, it does often just depend on what the CEO thinks. Yeah, they reckon it's important. Let me appoint an operations manager that sits just underneath them. Okay. All right. So there's your online clothing retailer. The next thing is, what would you do for the organizational chart of a purchasing department for an online retailer? So I've explained to you where you can put them. So this is talking now about the hierarchical level. So just a very quick sketch. I gave you a hint just now. It depends if you're paying attention. So an online clothing retailer. So how important do you think they are will dictate what your little diagram is going to look like. So CEO at the top, where are you going to put them? So maybe there's an operations department, maybe a marketing department. Are you going to put them under operations, or are you going to put them separate? All right, I think I'm going to stop here at about 50 seconds just for time reasons. Okay, post what you've got. Right, let's see what you thought there. And this is where you would have to have a little bit of critical thinking too. So remember that when you're asked to recommend, it's not that you'd be asked to draw this, by the way. Definitely not that you'd be asked to draw it, but yeah, where would you put it? So I like the people who are giving me triangles there. and showing me the level, which is great. I see a smiley face. Okay, I think we just about through that, so I'm going to stop at 30 seconds. Looks like everybody's done. Okay, so yeah, so the trick here is that, and I think there were definitely some diagrams here, but let's just go with this one anyway, because I think the point is, yeah, what you're trying to say is that it should be at the top level along with marketing operations and so on, and then underneath would be the supervisor. So yes, and I hope that most of you got that, because a retailer is not just buying standardized, maybe they're making furniture, they're just buying in the same amount of wood and the same amount of nails each month, but their big expense, of course, is their products themselves. So absolutely it should have been at the top level. Good. Okay, so that to me is the only thing that's as tricky about this chapter. The rest of it is just learning stuff and terms like this. What is a cross-functional team, and why should you have that? So just have a look at that, and then there's quite a few lists there, like what is the supplier selection process, what is the process that would be used, but you're not going to be asked long questions in terms of that. So you don't need to learn lists of processes. Okay, so just understand what these concepts are, and then, as I said, those are the two things that are important there. And then inventory is the next big thing. So hopefully you remember some of that from Business Management 1A. And this starts off just by explaining to you that there are costs of holding inventory. So this is one of the reasons why you recommend one type of inventory control system over another, such as just-in-time. Remember JIT from last semester? And then if there's a case of we don't want to hold too much inventory because we know that that's expensive, well, what is the problem with that? So being able to balance those two things. All right, but now we've extended these. So you only had, I think we had what, the MRP and JIT last semester. Now you've got quite a few more. This is commonly asked as well, and commonly not answered well, because these are terms that you perhaps haven't heard of before. You need to be able to explain them. You need to be able to look at a case study and say, yes, that is the one that they are using. So you need to be able to identify from the case study what they are using, or you could just be asked to explain what is just-in-time inventory and give an example. So that means you are going to battle to do that if you don't understand them. So definitely when you work through that section, spend a bit of time, make sure that you have got a good example. And if you find the book, because the book doesn't give you a lot of detail on this, maybe this is something that you just Google a little bit as well and find out, because it is asked quite often. Okay. All right, so let's have a look on your phone, a quick one. If you are purchasing textbooks and you order the same new textbook each time, what would you suggest that they use? And I'm going to give you a page number here as well. Because I think a lot of the rest of the chapter you can more just like read through it all. Okay, well done. Good. And the variations too that talk about things like for what would a supermarket do. So they've got their very specific one, like quick replenishment and so on. Then put down, as you've maybe making some notes on this, put down some examples as well. Right. So the selection of suppliers. So this is also just, I would say, for reading, for more sort of background reading, and then when to buy and all of that. There's a lot of detail in this chapter. You don't need to know any of those graphs there either. You don't have to draw those, but just to be able to, I think, read that and show how you understand it. Okay, so coming to the last learning unit. Now, this is really important, and another thing that I would like you to spend some time on, just like we spent time on the ratios, because you have to also try and think, given your limited time and how much there is to study for this, what do you know is going to come up? We know that the calculations are going to come up, and we know that there's going to be quite a lot from this chapter, and just like there's marks certainly from the purchasing and supply chapter, but the beauty of this one is it's really, really short. It's really short. So this is something that you can study very well, and you're going to get good bang for buck here, because what, 5 pages is, I think that's about all it is. Know that, be able to apply it, and you know there's going to be a lot of marks from it. Well, not necessarily overweight marks, but it hasn't been assessed before. Always, always, always comes up, and easy to study and learn for. So this, I think, should also be a priority for you. Thank you, Bianca. So page 623. Yes, I never got that far. All right, so yeah, that was for the last one. Thank you. All right, so you're going to find this on ARC. You're also going to find it as additional reading there under your study material, but basically everything you need is on ARC too. So starting off this, it's now saying, okay, you've understood all the functional areas, but now a strategic manager needs to look at those all together. And from this whole sort of section hinges around this diagram. Also, I won't have to draw the diagram, but I just think it positions everything nicely for you. And this basically says that you've got your strategic direction at the top, where your vision and mission and long-term goals then come from that. So that's the next block down. What else helps you with the long-term goals? Well, the external environmental analysis, internal environmental analysis, which you did in Business Management 1A. SWOT analysis, yes, that helps you come up with your strategic objectives. The focus of this then takes you to which is your generic strategy. Just one of the models that we use here is Porter's generic strategies. Basically says, are we going to compete in cost or on some other differentiating factor? And that is where these questions usually come from, those 3 main ones in the middle. Okay, so the first thing, you need to write this down for your vision. You need to know what makes a good vision statement. So just to keep it really simple for you, it's forward-looking, it's inspirational, the long-term direction. So it's kind of what you aspire to be in the future. It's also short. Okay, it's not meant to be long and detailed and kind of getting boring and wordy. It's meant to inspire you. It's meant to inspire customers, shareholders, employees. Okay, so short, long-term, future-looking, inspirational, aspirational, whatever you want to call it. That's what you must remember is a vision. And the vision goes right at the top. It's the very first thing that a business should have. So here are some of them, for example. Pick your favorite there and see if you would agree with that. So if you are asked to evaluate, and that was one of the past papers there that I had up, said evaluate in the case study their vision statement. So you have to first of all remember what makes a good vision statement. Oh yeah, it's short, it's inspirational, it's forward-looking and long-term. So now when you look at these, evaluate it based on that. There's nothing more concrete than that that's required. And can you see these are quite aspirational? You look at Starbucks, to nurture the human spirit. Disney, to create happiness. It is very lofty and lofty goals. Okay, so that means that if you asked to evaluate a vision statement, you must first of all give the 3 things and then evaluate it, and then at the end say yes, that it complied with that, or no, it didn't. And then the same thing with your mission statement. It should comply with these 3 things. So you need to learn these. Again, write them down. What am I going to do? If I'm asked to evaluate a mission statement, I need to give these 3 things and then tick, tick, tick if it does or doesn't comply with it. The first thing is that a vision gives you that overall high long-term view. The mission is a lot more concrete than that. It stems from the vision, but it's got to give more information. You should be able to read a mission statement and know who it is. So what their business is all about, whether it's the products or the services, what they actually do, needs to tell you what they are about. So you shouldn't have to look and see what the company's name is to know what they are all about. And then also what customers / market. So that becomes a little bit ambiguous, because the more specific the business is, the more they can identify a customer. Whereas somebody like Coke or Amazon, well, they're really just trying to serve the whole world. So then it could simply be something like that they are trying to meet all markets everywhere. But otherwise, if it's a more niche market, maybe it's just the public sector, maybe it's schools, it could be something that's very niche as well. So that should be in there. And then finally, a good mission statement should actually give you some information about what gives them that competitive advantage. What is that differentiator, or how do they do it? So another way of thinking about this is what, who, and how. So does it answer those three things? So you can imagine, therefore, that your mission should be a little bit longer, because how can you get that all across in just a short phrase? There's Amazon's. So if you had to read that and evaluate it, I'm going to give you a second to do that. Remember the three criteria: what, who, how. Okay, so when we look at that mission statement, then we can say, does it tell us who they are? So they're using technology, they try to give good customer experience, to be able to buy anything. So you could probably say, yes, they do. And if you were asked this question, you would write down point number 1. Does it tell you about the business and their products? And then you can, and I mean, it depends on how you argue it. Somebody might say, well, it does to a certain degree. I mean, and then you would pull out of the mission statement where you said that. And somebody else might say, yes, it does, because it says there that it's to help buy anything, anywhere, and empower businesses and content creators. Somebody else might say, well, it's not very specific, but you are still showing that you know what the factors are that you're using to evaluate it, and you've been able to quote sections from the mission to back up your position one way or another. So it's not like there's 100% right or wrong answer for this. And then secondly, does it say who? So basically it does say customers, and it gives you content creators and businesses. So I think that does tell you who. And then how? How to be the Earth's most customer-centric company. So you could then say, right, on the balance of all three of those things, I believe that they have a good mission statement. So you need to run through that whole process. This is typically also a case study type question. So remember that those are high value 10-mark type questions. So you can't just say, oh, well, I think they're good, or no, they're not. You need to be able to methodically list theoretical points, apply each of them, give an overall evaluation. Okay, so I'm not going to do that as an activity. I've kind of told you now, so I'm not going to ask you to write that down. I'm going to skip that one over, because I don't think it's actually that easy to do if I haven't told you how to do it. But hopefully now you know. So those are the two things at the strategic direction at the top block. And let's pull that down now for those blocks on the outside. So you should remember this, because did you not have to do a SWOT in Business Management 1A? I seem to recall that was there somewhere. Well, the main thing to remember here is that strengths and weaknesses are internal, and opportunities and threats are external. Okay, so you could never be asked to do a whole SWOT analysis. That would be too long. But certainly there could be elements of it, maybe just the internal factors, maybe just the external factors. So you've got to remember that if they ask you for internal, that's strengths and weaknesses. If they ask you for external, that's opportunities and threats. And you can't get them mixed up. So this does require a little bit of remembering what you did in Business Management 1A. So if you remember the macro environment from that, things you have no control over, that's going to be your opportunities. So it could be a favorable exchange rate. Threat could be new competition coming in. And then your weaknesses and strengths are things that you have control over that are internal to the business, the micro environment. Okay, so I hope that's given you a good idea as to what to be able to understand from that. All right, so that's what's coming in from the left and the right. The OT from external and the SWA from the internal, and together they're going to help you decide on what strategy are you going to choose. So Porter's generic strategies here, this is in those notes there. I've basically took it from there. And your most important distinction here is to be able to decide, is this business competing on cost or is it competing on differentiation? So the cost is pretty easy to determine. I think you can all think, if I had to say to you what would be a low-cost clothing company, you could probably get it. If I had to say a low-cost, I don't know, cell phone company, anything that a consumer product would fall into, you can think of those that compete based on price. And then the differentiation is a bit broader. So what are they differentiating on? Could be quality, could be innovation, but it's something that they are basically charging more because they are doing something that the competitors are not. So they are different. So that's the main distinction, the one they usually ask for. But then there is the extra one of, okay, are they focusing on one narrow niche? So one specific market. So they're just looking at children's shoes. And quite often, if they focus, they tend to be finding some way of differentiating themselves. So that would be the focus differentiation. Or they're aiming for the broad market, basically everyone. So all things to all men. So basically like a game would be offering to everybody. Whereas if you take one of the products that they sell and maybe go back to the shoes again, yeah, they've got children's shoes maybe, but you're going to find that a niche supplier of that would be definitely in the focus differentiation as opposed to the broad differentiation. And then, of course, game would probably be in the low cost category and bring broad low cost. So I also think that in this one, know what each of them mean and then have your own examples ready to go. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I think we are good to go there. And I'm going to ask you to do this quickly. Let's see how you're able to answer this one. And remember, this could be asked in that question 2, where you're given low cost strategy and you'd have to explain what that means and give your own example or story. Your example would not just be the one word that you're writing down now, but you would say why and how and all of those things as well. Okay, post your last answers there. Let's see how many of you thought about the same sort of companies. All right, let's see. There's Pep. It's front and center. Couldn't have thought of a better one because ultimately that's definitely what they are about. And Mr. Price coming up strong there. So yes, Mr. Price clothing. Yes, and those are reasons why, but they're fantastic. All right, good. So you've definitely got that and got a good understanding of it. So remember that that's if you are asked for the generic strategy, the business strategy that the business is using to compete on, part of the strategic management section, then you would have to know that the two choices are differentiation or low cost, and then a further subcategory would be, I'm just going to go back a second, would be whether it's focused or not. Okay, and then the last thing that I actually wanted to go back to this diagram for, first of all, though, was when you come up with the strategic objectives, then do you remember SMART goals? Do you remember SMART goals from Business Management 1A? They do make a mention of it in this chapter as well. I have seen them ask that before. So you might need to just do a bit of revision on that. Knowing what SMART stands for, knowing what makes a goal smart or not, being able to look at a goal and say, is it smart or what is it missing from that? And that could well be that it's not measurable, it's missing the M from smart, or it's not time bound, it's missing the T from smart. So just to remember that as well, learn that too. That's also something they ask. So typically, basically what I'm saying is from this chapter, it's very much application based. mostly going to come from the scenario if it's anything to go by the previous sections. And then the last bit in this, I think they give you 2 lines on what each of these things mean. So I think it's worthwhile just making sure that you understand that from a strategic point of view, you always want a strong culture in the company. You want a culture that where people are working together well. And this basically suggests that there's a web. The culture, you can't really define it or put your finger on it, but if you have to separate it out into all of these things like, yeah, the organization structure, but also those rituals and stories and routines that are going on, and the color schemes and what people have to wear and the dress code, and going from the sort of legends that happen around the stories that people tell, that people have gone out of their way to service a customer, those kind of things, or the rituals like singing the company song in the morning, or the Friday morning meetings, the routines that are involved there. Together, all of those things are going to help you establish or at least understand a company's culture. So that's basically what this ends up with. So that is at a very high level what, and by the way, you'll never be asked to learn this list of what is everything in the culture web, what is it made up of. So it's not like you need to know that, just rather perhaps a little bit of an understanding as to what each of these terms mean. But typically, as I say, it's being able to look at a case study and evaluate a vision, a mission, a SMART goal, a strategy, a SWOT. So those 5 things from this chapter are what's going to be most important. Okay, so I am going to go back briefly to those first 3 learning units, noting, however, that I did do that with you for the test already. So you can go back and see in a bit more detail that recording too. So I'll just briefly recap it, because I don't want to just go over and repeat everything again, but just to remind you, these things here. So when you look at the previous things there, that essay, remember, is not in there. You've only got multiple choice, then the define with examples, as you went over here, these kind of questions here, define with examples, your calculation question, and then your scenario, which, yes, it might have a couple of questions in it from learning units 1 to 3, but typically always from learning units 5 and 6. Okay, the application coming in there. Okay, so for those that just are looking at how do I get from there to then, I recommend a study schedule. And I hope you've seen from now that you need to have some sort of summary, whether you call it a worksheet or making mind maps, whatever works for you. But the content of the book is just too much, and they have not given us any more information in terms of weighting. All I can tell you is from the exam brief what I recommend. So the learning unit 6, easy, because it's not too much to study. So nail that, nail your calculations. But apart from that, if you don't make summaries, it's just the volume is too much to be able to study. So from now till your final exam, get those studies going and get those summaries going so you can learn off that. And then literally just tick them off as you've done it. And have those summaries ready so that in the last few days you can start just almost memorizing those. If you're still not sure of the calculations, practice them again. And then please, when you get there on the day, don't be stressed. I don't want you to arrive late, get stuck in traffic. Something happens where you end up arriving all flustered, and then all of your hard work will be sunk. So please just get there very, very early. There's no harm in just sitting quietly for a while and studying your notes one last time. But knowing that you're there, you're close to your venue. For those that are writing online, make sure everything's working. You've got backup power and all of those sort of things. Don't forget your calculator. You are allowed calculators. You can ask any questions there, but yeah, lastly then, and for those of you that want to go after this, then I will wish you a very good evening. For those that want to stick around, I am going to go through those the first 3 learning units, just as a bit of a recap that you can use to substitute. I think we spent like over an hour and a half or something on that for the test. So those of you that never wrote the test, it might be valuable for you to look at that again, but I'm also going to just do give a quick recap on that. But for everybody else, believe in yourself. You've got it. You've got this. So we'll be thinking of you and wishing you all the very, very best of luck on that. All right, so the last little bit of time then, I'm going to have to start this right from the beginning. I'm not going to ask any particular questions on it, so I am going to go through just the beginning. Okay, to remind you then that it is those 6 study units, and 1, 2, and 3 you've had a test on, most of you, and an assignment on, so hopefully the material is not too difficult for you. All right, so back to operations management. So similar to what I said to you for the test then, remember that you've got lots of different types of operations, and you can imagine that your case study is going to be some sort of operation. And the kind of material that they ask you here is not generic, airy-fairy type stuff, but more understand what operations is all about and why it's important. And then this operations model. So again, not being asked to draw it. You shouldn't be asked to explain any drawings for it. And the video that I did for the test, the recording from that, it is be posted at the same place. So you just need to ask your lecturer. It'll be together with where I post this one. Okay, it'll be a YouTube link. All right. So, but you saw in that one past paper there how you could be asked in a case study to identify the inputs, for example. And this should be something that you did beautifully for your assignment, so you should know that, hopefully. And to just reiterate that this is the tricky thing. So when you come to study, this is not something you're just going to remember. You'll remember, oh, your inputs, and then everybody just says, oh, it's the raw materials and leaves it at that. Don't forget that your book breaks us into aids and resources, so that's something that I would learn in case you get asked it, because it's not something that just relies on common sense. So what sort of inputs do we have? The transformation outputs are pretty easy. Okay, this is another thing that comes up quite often, not to draw, but being able to identify it. So either from a case study, what is the process type, or just even in a multiple choice, or in those explain and give examples of them. So something else you need to pay attention to. So based on variety, high variety at the top here, and how many items are actually made at a time. So high and high on each of those. And then you need to be able to name it and then show what is the difference between batch and jobbing. For example, that is perhaps the trickiest things. They're both sort of medium, but you have a batch of a certain product, whereas you do a job, so like a job lot. So those are perhaps the ones to pay attention to there, just in terms of what students often get confused with. But also, it's something you need to know, right? What are these names? What are the process types that a manufacturer can be involved in? And then the same thing with a service provider. They only have 3, but it's the same axes. So a dentist would be a professional service because they have 1 person at a time, but every person's different. Whereas a mass service would be like Mr. D, or one of those services like a courier guy. They're providing the same thing over and over again to thousands of people every day. All right, then the other thing to also note for this that they ask you to apply sometimes is, how is the operations department laid out? So visualize that factory floor, for example, and know what the names are for these. So this is something I would have in your summary notes, and then be able to give examples of them too. So, when you go and build the bridge, you go and build wherever it happens to be, or the house. Or are they laid out as in the process, or more like a production line? And then all the sort of hybrid type retailers, kitchen layouts, and so on, all that fall under the cellular layouts. That's something to note for that as well. All right, and then this was something I'm not going to ask you to do it again. I asked you to do this in the test one, but we would typically expect a hospital to be more like a hybrid, and a airplane manufacturer, as it goes through the hangar, would be more of an assembly line. Okay, and then they've got quite a few terms. I'm not saying this is all you need to learn. I'm saying this is what is typically done not so well, or where they ask you to apply it. So yeah, you do need to know what is total quality management and what is a work standard and those sort of things. But this is something that they sometimes will say, right, in this case study or in this scenario, or maybe even in a multiple choice, how should this operations department measure itself? And do they measure it against what they did last year? It's historical. Against their competitors, it's competitive. Or do they set a certain target and then they aim for that? And then they can only see how well they've done by comparing back to what their standards are. And these are the 4 choices that you have. So know those names of the different operations improvements. And then similarly, the operations improvements. So there's 5 types of failures. So another list that you can make a summary notes of. And from an operations perspective anyway, these are the common types of failures. So you could be asked to identify the failure or just explain what it means. All right, so something going wrong when the design of the operations, the actual facilities or equipment goes wrong, the employees running the equipment, something goes wrong there, the suppliers never gave you the right stuff, so that's the problem. Or maybe it didn't really have anything to do with the operations department, it was rather the way that the customer actually used the product. Okay, so those ones there. All right, so moving on to HR management then. So there we can see that you've got the whole planning exercise. So for this one, remember, you don't need to know any of the labor law, any of the acts in the second half. So yeah, in terms of what can you learn? Well, I think the overall explanations of what is the difference between those 3. So sometimes it's a differentiation type question as well. Yeah, so these slides will go up with your lecturers. They'll be able to find them there as well. Okay, so job analysis now, it sounds the same as job description specification. If you had to not know your work, it would be quite difficult to know what the differences are between those. So also just a case of knowing the definitions. So just the definitions of those, that should go in your sort of list of vocab to learn, or glossary almost, part of your planning. Okay, and then, what are the factors that you should consider if you're planning on hiring people? I think that's also quite intuitive. All right, and then having a plan so you know what jobs you need. You've got the description and the spec out, and then you can work from the HR plan. And then the next section goes on to how you can recruit from the inside or the outside of the organization. So from promoting within or putting adverts up on job boards and the various methods. So I don't think those are too difficult. Just be able to read through it, and if you ask the question on it, you need to be able to explain what they are. But it's not like it's a list that you need to memorize the terms of. Just know that what is available, and that there's various options that are internal, and there's pros and cons of hiring from inside and pros and cons from hiring outside. So I think you should be aware of those. Okay, then these ones, another list. Now this I do you think you should know? And in fact, I think this was in your assignment, so hopefully it's fresh on your mind. But there's on the job or away from the job. Those are 2 distinct categories. And then within on the job, there's a whole long list. That's one that you had to do, I think. And then away from the job, there's a whole lot that apply there as well. So that's how you develop your staff. So that's also worth knowing. And then just in terms of that, the whole sort of, is it job enlargement? Is it job enrichment? Is it job rotation? Know what the difference is between those. All right, and you saw this question earlier, we mentioned it, the types of compensation, so not getting confused between those, and also not confusing rewards and indirect compensation. Okay, so the rewards are typically non-monetary, or at least get a nice holiday for doing particularly well. And then direct compensation is the amount that typically you see on your payslip. All right. So this one is a little bit tricky now. So this is where you need to decide on how much effort you're going to be put on. So definitely no legislation of HR in the exam, 100%, definitely not. Your question there. Because these are quite tricky. They're quite very theoretical, aren't they? So we know that there's these people's names. They've each got their own different ways of explaining things. So you're going to need to decide if this is maybe you're good at just studying these and learning them off by heart. But it is a lot to learn, and there's usually not too many marks from it. So it might be that sort of 5 marks explain what motivation factors are. Remember that one I showed you earlier? The hygiene factors, maintenance factors. So that might be the case, but you're not going to be asked, to explain Alderfer's ERG theory and just memorize the whole thing. Okay, so remember, it's not that type of exam. So you go through those, and I would say, like, okay, what does NARCH mean? Yes, I do need to remember that stands for need for achievement. So learn the specifics and what the names are of what the components are there, as opposed to just being able to rattle off what all of the theories are and what they stand for completely. All right, and then the other process approach, those are the other 3 there. So expectancy theory, equity theory. So like, yes, what do those actually mean from a motivational perspective, but also not from the idea of having to explain the whole thing again. Okay, so yeah, it depends how much time you've got, because obviously I would like you to know it all, but it is a lot to remember, I know. So yeah, you'll have to weigh up how much time you've got to put into that. All right, and then the last chapter that we're covering tonight is marketing management. It's a big chapter. Some of you are in the fortunate position where you've done a whole marketing module and it's the same author, so it should be quite simple for you. Now, in terms of this, it's like, yes, what does this principle actually mean? But not, you have to learn the whole lot. So you might be asked, what is the principle of profitability? So know what that means, but you don't need to know, okay, I must memorize what the 4 principles of the marketing concept are. You don't have to know that level of detail. Okay, so it's more just like, what are they? All right, and then consumer behavior. So there, it's quite generic. I would say read that for sort of background stuff, but you would need to be able to explain things like, oh, well, what affects a consumer behavior? You know, what are those individual factors? And not as a diagram, not as a whole list either, but just more from an understanding perspective and the fact that there are those various steps. So typically, I've only ever seen them ask about processes, maybe, you know, in a more general sense. So you don't need to learn lists of processes, but, you know, be aware of what comes after what and be able to explain, oh yeah, if those are the 5 steps, then when I apply it to this case study, I can see that this is talking about step 4. So in other words, be able to explain it. All right, so yeah, there's your consumer behavior stuff again. So knowing what influences consumers. There's your 5 stages. So know what's involved, as opposed to having to learn the list. You don't have to learn the list. Another one for application. So what are the types of market segmentation? What is a market? And, you know, knowing the difference between those various types of markets. And then also, you know, when you choose an approach to target your market, what are you going to use? So not having to draw it, but just very simply, are you going for a single segment or multi-segment? So just a simple, short little definition of each of those is what I would focus on there. Okay, this they do ask you sometimes to apply it. Okay, so hopefully this is something you are familiar with, and there, I think it's really just not getting confused between psychographic and behavioral. So I think everyone knows what geographic and demographic is, and then if you had to get, typically in a case study situation, what are they using to segment the market, and then you should be able to say, oh yes, okay, psychographic and behavioral. So know what those 2 particularly mean and be able to understand it. Okay, and then a lot of the focus on this chapter is on the marketing instruments. If you think about it, it's your 4 Ps. You may have heard of those before, but yeah, this chapter uses the proper terminology for it. A lot spent on the product, and then sort of trickling down into the other aspects. Okay, so there's some more terms for you to know, be able to differentiate between those. Not in a theoretical perspective, but what is a core product? So maybe from a multiple choice perspective, if you get given a question, which is the core, what is the formal? Those are, to me, things that you perhaps don't know. So you would want to just have your definitions written down. Same thing here, although I have seen this asked in a case study type situation as well, like what is name and explain the type of product that they're using. So the 3 main types there, also not too difficult. All right, and then branding. So what is a brand? Yeah, I think that there's a lot of information there which you can just read more for background. And then, maybe some of the terminology is what does brand recognition mean? What does brand insistence mean? Right, here's the types of brands. So this one can be quite interesting. I think, how do we distinguish between those sort of no-name brands that you see in the supermarkets versus the manufacturer's brand, and then how you can also get individual versus family brands. So, like your Kellogg's and all of the different cereals that are involved in the family brand, as opposed to maybe a sort of once-off product that's just all marketed on its own and doesn't rely on the rest of the family. All right, and then the dealer products, so like a Mr. Price who has the red label, and then the Checkers and Pick and Pay and all of those supermarkets that have the more generic brands of the manufacturer. So the Koo baked beans and then the no-name brand baked beans. Okay, so that's something worth looking at. This was a very odd one in this book, that they only give you 3 types of packaging. So no, those are the 3 that you can look at, and I think you could sometimes be asked, what does it mean, or to identify a specific type of packaging used. So this maybe is one thing that you would note, because probably wouldn't have been obvious to you that those are the 3 decisions to make. So another graph that you don't have to draw. So I hope you've seen the common theme there. You're not going to be asked to draw any of these, but I just think that the book actually explains this really well in terms of the type of marketing that's needed at the different stages of the product life cycle. But it's also not something that you're going to be expected to do in terms of explain the entire 4 Ps that work across this stage of the cycle. So what should they do in the growth phase and so on. So I'd say more just for background reading. Okay, and then the price decisions. So yeah, knowing what the price is about and then the sort of stages that were involved. I think it was also in your assignment, so I wouldn't expect you to get that again, but you should know what those mean. What is a target price? What is a final price? It should go on your sort of list to learn. And then what is a leader price? What is an odd price? What is a bait price? Those sort of things. Okay, so that, I think, if you're not aware of what they are, it should go on your summary notes. Right, then we've got the distribution decisions, and this is just not like you'd have to list the 5 different alternate channels. It does not work like that. But, just to sort of read for more awareness of what we mean by distribution and the difference between a wholesaler and a retailer and how that sort of flow works. Something, a bit of a term there to pay attention to is a channel captain. So who's in charge? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the retailer? So is it Checkers who, yeah, they're definitely in charge and dictate to the manufacturers? Or is there somebody who looks after the manufacturer, who is basically dealing with them? They look after that particular channel. Or is it the manufacturer who takes the lead? Just a term to learn. Okay, this is quite a good one though. So what sort of market coverage do we expect to be able to apply those? Something that students don't always get right. So name those. What are you doing in terms of your distribution? Are you just blanketing everywhere? Or are you being exclusive and selective, and maybe just make sure that you know what the difference is between those? So are you having just one outlet? They've got the sole distributor, or are you being more selective, perhaps choosing quite a few, but not just everywhere where it's intensive market coverage? So the difference between those. Okay, and you had, I think, also in your assignment and sort of advertising, and had to think of something around that. So yeah, you don't need to memorize the list of the 6 elements, but what would you do if you were asked, what does direct marketing mean? What does publicity mean? So just, if you are not very familiar with those, have your definitions ready to go. All right, and then the end of this chapter just talks about customer service, and they give a couple of things that are important about customer service. I think they're very intuitive, and I wouldn't worry too much about those, but maybe just know, maybe, personalized versus customized, and yeah, that's basically the end of that chapter. It's a very long one, though. All right, so that takes us back to where we started with the financial management. So I'm going to zoot back down to the end and tell you again, you've got this. Believe in yourself. Wishing you all the very, very, very best of luck. I hope it goes well for you. I hope that you are on the day fresh and are able to put that application in. Remember again, think of the theory, apply the theory, be methodical in every answer. Don't rush into just giving the theory and forgetting about the application, or perhaps what I see more often, rushing to give the application, particularly with the case study or scenario, and not remembering that it had to have a theoretical basis first. So stop, think, what is the chapter this is coming from? What can I remember about that theory? And then you can go off and try and apply it. All right. Yes. So thank you so much for sticking it out. And it's been a very long time. And I appreciate you being here. And yeah, just all the very best. So stay on if you've got any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording and wish you, for one last time, a very, very happy exam. And after that, a wonderful festive season and a well-deserved break. Yes, go for it. I see you've got your hand up.